Want to do better? Then it's time to change the story. Welcome to our show about new visions currently transforming the world through the confluence of art, tech, and innovation. And now your hosts, Michael Ashley and Neil Sahota.
Welcome to another episode of Changing the Story. We have a fantastic guest today, Dr. Diane Terry. She's an experienced researcher in social welfare and program evaluation. Her research focuses on mental health disparities among communities of color, permanency, and well-being outcomes for youth and families. She currently serves as the project coordinator for the California Reducing Disparities Project Statewide Evaluation Team, which is a multi-year, multi-site evaluation of community-defined evidence practices addressing mental health and wellness throughout California. Her book, Everyday Desistance, The Transition to Adulthood Among Formerly Incarcerated Youth, examines how formerly incarcerated youth navigate reentry and transition to adulthood in urban Los Angeles. Dr. Terry, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thanks for being here, Diane. So, Diane, as a visionary, what is the story that you want to bring to the world?
I think the idea that I would most want to share really revolves around the idea of how can we humanize and show that all lives matter, particularly among formerly incarcerated youth. And I think we can do that by re-envisioning a criminal justice system and a social safety net that recognizes the journey of moving away from crime and also acknowledges that people will make mistakes along the way, and that's part of the process as well.
Absolutely.
So Dr. Terry, what's one of the biggest challenges that you see working with the youth? I mean, what's happening?
Yeah, how much time do we have? I think it has a lot to do with this idea that when young people tend to get involved with the criminal justice system, there's so many barriers that they encounter both inside of the system and then also once they return home, and that there is no one straightforward, quote unquote, success story. I think we all like the idea that someone gets in trouble, they come home, they get a job, they finish school, and now they're successful and life is better from there on out. And I think that the process, from what I've discovered in research, is not linear. It's going to be full of, starts, moving backwards, moving forwards, starting yet again. And it's very nonlinear in that way.
I'm really glad you're bringing this up because this is something that has bothered me for many years. When I was back in college, we talked about the whole philosophy behind punishment. And it seems to me incredibly unfair that someone makes a mistake, especially when they're young. When we were young, we did things that were, not in the best interest, right? You don't have that hindsight you do when you get much older, but then you're penalized for the rest of your life. And so we look at the way that we are handling our prisons right now. We look at the way that the punishment is occurring. It's not just we send somebody away to prison. We ruin their lives. Essentially, once that occurs, there is no coming back into regular society for most people. I can personally say that when it came to filling applications for renting an apartment or getting a job, they have those questions on there. And so it's like you have this black mark for the rest of your life, and that there is really no hope for you to then rejoin society, because for the rest of the time when you're back, people are judging you. And I'm glad that you're bringing up these issues right now.
Yeah, and I think also for formerly incarcerated youth in particular, so if you've spent any amount of time in your adolescence getting in trouble, whether it's once, twice, kind of ongoing, there's this really unique period of life, which is kind of coined the transition to adulthood. And that's where, 18 to 24, that's generally a time where you are trying to figure it out. You are perhaps making mistakes, you're taking risks, you're exploring your identity. And so the idea behind the research that I started doing was really looking at, for formerly incarcerated youth, they're often not afforded that safety net that, say, middle to upper class individuals typically have, right? If you're fortunate enough to go to college or to have a family who can kind of support you, maybe help you to get a job, if you make a mistake, right, which, like, as you mentioned, 18-year-olds probably do,
right,
there's a safety net for you to fall back on. But for formerly incarcerated youth, it's often the case where that safety net is not there, or the standards are so much higher. So when they make that mistake, when they take a risk, as they're bound to do, there's nothing there to catch them. and then they're penalized further. And so it's that cycle that doesn't stop.
Look, I know the transition is hard. Like, I remember when I was about to leave for an assignment to China, where I'd be out there for a while, they were saying, like, when you come back to the US, you'll have trouble adjusting back to life here. I'm like, yeah, right, whatever. I was born here. They were absolutely right. I remember my friends picking me up, we're driving on the freeway, and I was weirded out. And I couldn't put my finger on it first. And I realized it's so quiet. I've used so many honking horns on the streets of China. That's when it dawned on me, wow, it's going to take me time to get adjusted. But, I was an adult. I got some life experiences, that's resilience, some coping skills. But when you're that young and you go through an incarceration, it's a major life change, right? I mean, you don't have some of these skills. I mean, what are people doing, or is it just expectation that they're going to have to figure it out?
Yeah, and I think it's a little bit of both. So, there does tend to be a lot of focus on those first few months when people get home, that, if you just kind of get them the right supports, get them a job, get them in school, then that sets them off for kind of longer term success. But what I've kind of found in my research is that even although that initial period is really, really critical, it's over time, and it's kind of the lack of sustained support that can really become challenging. So for instance, I worked with young people or met them in my research where they were kind of that quote unquote poster child for the organizations they were involved with. They got a job, they went to school, they were often advocates for the program, saying you can turn your life around, and so on and so forth. But what happens a year later when they go to a party with their friends and they might run into a former enemy? Or they figure, okay, I can let my guard down a little bit, let me go to a party, and the police show up at that party. Well, who's going to get arrested or kind of re-brought in? It's the person with the record. And so I found that there tends to be young people who fall into these groups where they've completely cut off old friends, old ties, old networks. They're often leading these really, really serious lives. They're married, they're parents, they're working these incredibly difficult jobs. And you would think, wow, this is like a 50-year-old man, and he's 20 living this kind of life. And then there's others who might kind of fall into a pattern of, I'm trying to turn my life around, but when I hit roadblocks, I'm going to resort back to some crime because I need to eat. I may not have a family to return to, or the environment that I'm returning to, it's a little bit toxic for me, but at the same time, that's the only place I have to go. So you kind of find people who are in these different groups trying to change, trying to move forward, but again, they kind of get stuck in the cycle because of that lack of a safety net.
Well, even bringing up when you say, needing to eat, right? And I think at the heart of crime, when we're talking about in this country, the real heart of it, I think it has to do with there aren't enough opportunities for people to have the economic future that they want, right? And so it's very difficult to make it in this country. And I think it's getting harder and harder to make it in this country. And it's not as if people set out to be a criminal. It's just you have to do what it takes to provide for yourself, to provide for your family. And so it makes me think we need to look at the economic situation, the economic system that produces crime. And I wonder what your thoughts are there, how to make a more equitable world so we're not seeing so much crime anymore.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, that's such a tough question. I think in general, there aren't enough. And again, I think when you go to college, for example, there's internships. There's chances where you have to explore different things to say, oh, I might be interested in this job. And there's those resources available to you, right? Mm-hmm. And I find that for formerly incarcerated youth, those opportunities often don't exist. Or one thing that I find is that it tends to be when there are jobs, they are jobs, right? It's like, oh, there's a construction job, there's this. But who asked that youth, what's your long-term vision like for a career? So when you're not able to do this job anymore, and for some, it is going to be those hands-on trade skills, but how do we kind of nurture their dreams and visions? Mm-hmm. So there was a young man who I came across who was kind of in this cycle of kind of fast food work, seasonal work, cyclical work in that way. He would get laid off and try to find another job. But in the meantime, he was kind of working on just side ventures. And this was maybe around 2010. And he told me about this really great idea he had where he was using his car to drive other people around. and they would pay him money so that he could drive them to where they needed to get. And then when later Uber and Lyft explodes, I'm like, oh my gosh, that was him. That's exactly what he was doing. He had so many different ventures like that. He was an entrepreneur, but where were those opportunities for him to kind of nurture that dream and those passions?
Mm-hmm.
It's tough, right? I mean, there's a stigma when you've been incarcerated, and even if you try to do your best, I know other people are going to look at you differently. And I know some of your work is around like mental health and wellness. I got to think that even if you come out, you're physically okay, and you're trying to get reacclimated, trying to get a job, there's still a mental toll that may be weighing down on you, right? I mean, I look at it right now with COVID and the quarantine, and hey, we're opening everything up, go back to work, do these things. It's like so many of us were stressed and anxious, PTSD,
Right.
Is it? I got to think that for these youth, this is like something to the nth degree that they're going through.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of undiagnosed trauma among youth who've been incarcerated is just astounding. There's disparities in terms of the types of treatment youth get. Let's say if they're in a juvenile detention facility, sometimes there's services there, sometimes there's not. And then, yeah, when you come home, it's often about those external things: get a job, go to school, cut off the gang, all of that. But who's dealing with the fact that you witnessed murder,
Right.
at different points in your life, or you grew up in a foster care system and were bounced around to different foster homes, or you were that youth who maybe just got in trouble one time, did something stupid, ended up being tried as an adult because of the nature of sometimes how certain crimes are viewed, and then the trauma you experienced just from being incarcerated alone. And I think the flip side of that then is that when there are mental health supports available, what do those services really, really look like? And you can imagine, especially for youth who've kind of been institutionalized, the last thing someone wants to go and do is then go and sit at a traditional therapist office and say, well, here's what's wrong, I'm depressed. That's not even something that's necessarily interesting, appealing, or even, especially for communities of color, necessarily the way that we process trauma. And so I think it really is about looking at alternative ways of treating trauma. So there's a program called Inside Out Writers, and they offer writing classes for youth who are incarcerated. The way that those youth open up to that program because someone simply allowed them to share their story, and in the process of writing, they were able to process that trauma and kind of share it and think through it and reflect on it. Those youth might have never spoken if they were laying down on a therapist's couch, but it was kind of looking at alternative ways of treatment and letting people share their grief. I think those are the strategies we need to invest in.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can definitely see how that can be extremely helpful. And I can also see how it'd be very hard, especially if, in order to survive, it was up to you to distance yourself from your feelings and to armor up. And then once you're out of that situation, or at least somewhat out of that situation, now they're asking you to open up about that, and how that can be very difficult to do something like that. About a year ago, I was listening, I think it was on NPR, and had John Legend talking about the idea of prison reform. And so it was the first time I really even heard about this whole idea. This was way before defund the police and things like that. But the whole idea that we begin to even look at the way the prisons work now is not good at all. And say most people don't deserve to be in prison at all, especially for people that have nonviolent offenses. And I wonder what your thoughts are about even just changing the entire prison system, the way that we are supposedly meting out justice. What your thoughts are about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think it's hard for us to even envision a world where that type of criminal justice system doesn't exist. And I do feel that if the demographics that people picture when they picture formerly incarcerated youth, I think if it looked more like who they were or who they saw as their children or their family friends or family members, and the humanity that would be involved in serving those, right? We all know someone who's been in trouble and felt like, man, all they really needed was a job or a counseling program or, something like that. I think it would look different. I think that when you have kind of, especially when you look at like the 90s and different eras where that idea of the juvenile justice super predator came out, where he's this hardcore young man of color. There's no stopping him. He's almost monstrous in terms of the acts he's committing. Well, then you're definitely going to design a criminal justice system that reflects what type of punishment you think that person should have. Mm-hmm. But when I think of someone, a young man I met by the name of Tyrone, got in a lot of trouble, could not break that cycle. When he talks about the programs inside the criminal justice system that were most effective for him, it was a football program. It was the first time in his life he had ever been on a team. It was the first time where he was ever given leadership responsibilities as part of that team. And he thrived when he was a part of that program. He was still in a juvenile detention camp. Mm-hmm. But for him, he really found some security. He found a place to showcase his skills. He probably would not get that in other settings, or even once he returned home under the probation system. And so when I think about re-envisioning a criminal justice system, it's how do we have opportunities like that? How do we recognize that a 16-year-old young man might want to be on a football team, even if he has been in trouble, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think your key word right there is opportunity, right? We have to create opportunities for the youth so that they can do these things. But I think we also kind of got the drag down here, and that we have a society or even a culture of crime and punishment, right? Mm-hmm. And it sounds like we have to kind of transform that mindset to create more of these opportunities. I mean, how do we actually go about as a society doing that?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I don't know. I mean, I think part of it is getting the narratives out there of who an actual incarcerated youth is. One thing I was so struck by with the young men and women who I worked with was the amount of youth who go and serve these really long sentences for really minor crimes. I mean, I don't know the extent to which people are aware that you can get caught up in the youth justice system by having a series of tickets that you get from riding the bus without riding the train without a ticket that you've paid for. Mm-hmm. Or that if you go AWOL, which is you kind of leave a group home without permission, you can get arrested for that. And once you're in that system, it is very, very hard to break out. One of the young men we went, he ended up fighting a trial. So, there was a law where it basically said that you could be tried as an adult depending on the severity of your crime. That stemmed from him stealing a jacket from someone off the bus. And so, not to say that it was okay for him to steal that jacket, but luckily he was able to beat that charge, but he spent about 2 years in a juvenile detention facility fighting that case. So I think that when people think about a youth who's incarcerated, it's always, well, but they should have, it's like, yeah, that he stole a jacket. And so I think part of it is also getting some of those narratives out there so that people really, really think about what some of these crimes were.
Sorry, go ahead, Neil.
Right, because that's such a great point. And I think this is changing the story, but I think you're talking about sharing the stories because we tend to think of these criminals as just a lump of people, and we dehumanize them. Mm-hmm. Right? I think by telling the stories, we hear the human aspect, and I think we can all relate to some of the things. Oh, wait a second, that's not really a crime. This guy, okay, he didn't have his bus pass, or couldn't afford a bus pass, shouldn't be thrown into the system like that, and maybe that's a good step in creating this mind shift or cultural change.
Exactly.
And it just feels so unfair. It seems so outsized in proportion to what happened. Going back to the fact that, obviously when you're younger, especially if you don't have the same economic opportunities that would force you into making those decisions. Going back to what Neil was saying a moment ago about opportunities. But I'm going to change the gears here to maybe even go more to a positive place for a second. What are the stories? What are the people you've worked with lately that give you hope? Things that you're really excited and proud about that are great things that are occurring that you see?
I think in terms of formerly incarcerated youth, I think it's giving me a lot of hope that I've been able to stay in contact with a few of those youth over time. And I know one young man I can think of in particular, two actually have become community activists. Mm-hmm. So it's about them now working in the communities where they grew up and really trying to affect policy change, right? So not just looking at the individual and how can I personally change, but what are the reforms that are needed in our schools? Because I started getting in trouble around the 4th grade and there was no help for me there, right?
Yeah.
What are some policy reforms that are needed just in our community? How do we have clean parks? How do we, that type of thing? And so seeing those youth, I think, has be involved in systemic change has been helpful. I also think a young man who was involved with the study is now getting his PhD, right? And this was a young man who was heavily gang involved and actually chose not to be a part of programs once he got out that were kind of for formerly incarcerated youth. Because there are those youth, right? They're tired. That's not the label that they want to carry with them. And so seeing his trajectory and where he's gone has been encouraging. And then I think going back to the point around mental health, there's this initiative that's the California Reducing Disparities Project in California. And it's an initiative that's completely designed to support community-defined treatments, community evidence for improving mental health. And it's looking at what are those non-traditional ways that communities of color and LGBTQ communities across the state are treating mental health for young people and doing a lot of that prevention in ways that look nothing like the traditional mental health system. So there's a program in Fresno that teaches youth how to harvest, Black youth, how to harvest sweet potatoes. And sweet potatoes have, cultural ties for the Black community, but it's also teaching them a business skill. And they actually get to work with Black farmers in the area. They get to work in a college environment. They actually then go to farmers markets and learn how to sell the potatoes. And so when I see programs like that, I'm like, that's so awesome, because it's a mental health prevention strategy that's getting funded by the state for the very first time and looks nothing like what you would think of as mental health. And that encourages me.
That's amazing, because my better half, she actually works in health and wellness. And one of the most effective things that our organization has found is actually building like low-cost apartments, right? They've learned that if we can give this and they offer them 6 months of free rent and they can stay, that's the only way they can get these people to actually think about proper nourishment, these other things. It's almost like a Maslow hierarchy of needs, right?
Yes.
Help with the base needs first, then they'll be open to doing some of these other things. I mean,
exactly.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
That program is only in stage 2 right now. How many stages are there?
It's phase 2. It's the second phase of it. The first phase was really doing a national state assessment to see what are the ways that communities are treating their own members' mental health. And then phase 2 is actually evaluating the implementation of some of those efforts. So part of what we're doing as a statewide evaluation team is seeing how are these strategies either more effective or as effective as traditional mental health services. And they run the gamut from harvesting sweet potatoes to gardening with Hmong elders to just anything that you can think of. But it's looking at what are kind of like the culturally based ways that communities have always kind of met their needs. And then how can we really start listening and supporting those?
That's awesome. And because this show is about positive visions, I just wonder from you, let's imagine it's 5-10 years from now and you're seeing more initiatives like what you're talking about right now. Could you paint us a picture of what that world would look like if more things like this begin to occur in a positive fashion?
I think we wouldn't have a need for a juvenile justice system if we could really try to imagine a world where people's needs were met. I read an op-ed recently that was saying the reason why people are having a hard time with the idea of abolishing the police is because we can't envision, we've lost sight of a community that actually didn't need police because our needs were met. So, what would it look like to where if someone was having challenges, a social worker could come? Or even when I think about neighborhood peace workers who, when fights or issues might break out between different gangs, or there's a shooting or something happens, it's former gang members or maybe just some of the older gang members who come immediately to that situation and help diffuse it. And so I imagine, that's what I imagine is a community who has their own elders and leaders stepping up to kind of provide for their own needs, to where there isn't domestic violence, right? Because our needs are met. I think it's a world where we see that people have the best that they have to offer, and there's a society that supports that.
Well, Dr. Terry, I hope that comes true.
Me too.
I hope it's faster than 10 years.
Yes.
If people want to learn more about your work and these projects, what's the best way to keep up to date and follow what's happening?
So I would encourage anyone who's interested in kind of reading some of these stories I talked about to check out a book co-authored with Laura Abrams, and it's called Everyday Desistance, the Transition to Adulthood Among Formerly Incarcerated Youth. And I would also tell them to check out the Psychology Applied Research Center at Loyola Marymount University. That project is just one of many where it's really supporting community-based efforts in a variety of social justice-related issues.
Awesome. Thank you for this, and thank you for all the work you're doing for us, Dr. Terry. Very much appreciated.
Thank you for having me. It was great speaking with you both.
Thank you. Hey, if you like today's show, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment.
If you've been enjoying the Changing the Story podcast series, please subscribe and share it with your friends.
Thank you.